Great.
All right, so this week we are starting right at the top of the order with Acts 10, chapter 1. So if you haven't turned in your Bibles to Acts 10, please do so now. Last week, we looked at two miracles that the Apostle Peter was given to do. And one of those was a healing miracle, healing a paralyzed man, Aeneas. And the other was a restoration to life miracle of Tabitha in the town of Joppa. And at the end of last week's study, you may remember there was this tantalizing little hint of what is to come at the end of chapter 9, where it says that the Apostle Peter stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. And we talked about how that was so interesting that Peter chose to dwell under the roof of a man who would be considered by Orthodox Jews unclean because his profession put him in contact with dead animals as a tanner. And how this certainly represents some kind of ongoing change in Peter, that he's coming to have a new understanding of what it means to be clean or unclean, and that he's progressing in that God is revealing things, teaching things to him about that whole business of being pure and being clean in the sight of God, and how that goes beyond just the physical to really include greater things, spiritual cleanness and purity. But Peter's not done learning yet. In this chapter, we'll see he has a lot more to learn, and that God has a lot more to show him. And so today we're going to look at Peter's vision, a fairly well-known passage, I think, as if you look at the entirety of the book of Acts, I think this is one that people would tend to know more than others, Peter's vision where God declares all foods clean. And then the second part of that, which we may or may not get to, which is an invitation from a Roman centurion, Cornelius, to come and stay with him, which represents God making not just all foods clean, but all people clean. Okay, so we get kind of two different things going on in that. I want to put up a map that I showed last time, because there are some place names mentioned here. So last time when we were talking about the two miracles that Peter performed, those were in the town of Lydda and Joppa. And today, the things are going to start off again in Joppa, where Peter stayed for some time, but then Cornelius lives in Caesarea. Here, Caesarea, there are two Caesareas in the New Testament. One of them is this one, Caesarea, sometimes just known as Caesarea, or other times called Caesarea Palestine or Caesarea Maritime, because it's along the coast. It's a coastal city, a harbor city. The other Caesarea is Caesarea Philippi, and that is a town that's off of this map. I think it's to the north. I think it's north of the Sea of Galilee, but it's inland. And so even though they go by the same name, they're two very different places. This city of Caesarea, if you just look at that map to give you some idea, it's about 32 miles north of Joppa. So when it talks about Cornelius sending 3 men to come and visit Peter in Joppa, just understand that was a journey of about 32 miles, and then Peter going to Caesarea to meet Cornelius face to face. Any questions about that map or about the places we're going to be talking about? I'd also just mention that this Caesarea is mentioned fairly often in the book of Acts. The Apostle Paul set sail from the town of Caesarea, the port of Caesarea, several times. One of them, most recently in our reading, was when he got chased out of the area because of some Greek-speaking Jews who were trying to take his life. And so Paul was sent off to Tarsus via this town of Caesarea. But even later on, when Paul gets put on a ship and sent to Rome, that he left from Caesarea. So there's quite a lot of action that takes place in this city here, right along the coast. It's a very important coastal city. Okay, and it makes great sense, therefore, why a Roman centurion would be stationed there, because there was quite a lot of significance to it. All right, well, let's get into it. Let's read our first section of chapter 10. Let's read verses 1 through 8. If somebody could take that for us, please.
In Caesarea, there was a man.
No, go ahead. That's good.
You got it, Shirley.
In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort, as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. One afternoon at about 3 o'clock, he had a vision in which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, "Cornelius." He stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" He answered, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon, who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside." When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called 2 of his slaves and a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him, and after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa.
Always a good idea to obey an angel, right? When an angel tells you to do something, you do it. Here's a man who understands commands from a higher authority. As a military man himself, just thinking about that, he is a centurion. How many soldiers would a centurion be in charge of? Anybody?
100.
100, right? That's where they get the name from. Very good. Not a trick question. And so just to think, there's probably not a lot of things that would bring terror to a man who's had that kind of military experience, but an angel of the Lord showing up and speaking to him in a vision, yep, that did it. And he obeys. Thinking just a little bit about the significance of a centurion being featured in the story of God and the story of God's people, keep in mind that the Romans were looked at as a heathen power, right? Polytheistic, pagan, and they were also seen as a tyrannical power over the people of Israel, occupying and holding power over land that God had gifted to his people. And so don't underestimate the amount of animosity there would have been between the Jewish population and any Roman, especially a Roman centurion who represented the sword of Rome, the worst part of Rome, the part of Rome that so often created humiliation and abuse and all of this to the Jewish people. To the zealots, a Roman soldier would have been absolutely intolerable. The zealots were always trying to throw off Roman power. To the Pharisees, which would be more along the lines of the group that Peter would have associated with, although we're not told he was a member of the Pharisees, but to the Pharisees, I think generally the attitude of the Pharisees was one of resignation. They understood that Rome was in charge, but they still held a great deal of disdain for Romans in general, and Roman soldiers and tax collectors in particular. So just the very presence of a Roman centurion talking to the Apostle Peter is remarkable in itself. Having said that, though, On the other side of the equation, what's really interesting is that when you look back to the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and of course, Acts was written by Luke as well as the Gospel, the two places where centurions show up in the Gospel of Luke are both positive, not negative depictions of Roman centurions. Can anybody off the top of their heads think about where in the Gospels a centurion would show up?
To the crucifix.
Yep.
Yeah.
Somebody say it?
Well, it was at this crucifixion, I think.
That's right. That's right. In Luke chapter 23, verse 47, Luke tells us that there was a centurion, obviously, because it's a crucifixion, and a centurion would have been in charge of keeping watch over that whole event, that execution. But in verse 47 of chapter 23, Luke writes, when the centurion saw what had taken place, and what had taken place is Jesus crying out, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. So even though, generally speaking, we can understand how a Roman centurion would be the object of hatred and disdain by the Jewish people, generally speaking, in Luke's gospel, we see signs of unexpected faith and faithful utterances from Roman centurions. So that's one example. Can anybody remember the other example of Jesus interacting with a centurion?
There was one where the centurion had somebody under him that was sick, and he said, "You don't even have to go you don't have to come to me. All you have to do is say that he'll be all right and he'll be okay." Is that the one you're talking about?
Got it. Yep, that's the other occasion. That was in Luke chapter 7, where Jesus heals a centurion's servant. And not only is it a healing miracle, but just as you said, Margaret, the centurion, understanding what it means to be under authority, says to Jesus, just say the word and my servant will be healed. And when Jesus heard the centurion say that, he marveled and turned to the crowd and said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. So this is something that we see again and again, particularly in Luke's gospel, is this, what's sometimes referred to as the great reversal. That is, those people whom you would expect to believe, like observant Jews and well-instructed Pharisees and Sadducees, those are the people who are not believing in Jesus, while those people you would think would be the last to believe, Romans, centurions, tax collectors, Samaritans, these are the people who are putting their faith in Jesus. Yeah? All of which is to say, by the time you get to Acts chapter 10 and hear that there is a Roman centurion there, you're almost prepared to expect something faithful and good to come from him, because we've seen this before. Yeah. What does Luke tell us about the spiritual state or the spiritual life of this centurion here in the verses in Acts chapter 10 that we read? How is he described?
Religious man.
Yeah. Devout, God-fearing.
Pray to God always.
Yeah. Constant in prayer.
Give alms generously.
And generous in giving alms. Yeah. Which is a big deal for the Jewish people. The giving of alms, giving in support of orphans and widows. This is a really important practice of the Jewish people. And so what Luke is telling us is that, yes, this is a Roman centurion, but he's a God-fearer, meaning that he has learned about Judaism and he is actively practicing some of the core tenets of faithful Jewish living. Now, from what we know about people of his stature who were not born Jewish, but are kind of on the periphery of Judaism, he hasn't undergone circumcision, right? Which you could imagine would be a little bit of a hang up for men who feel drawn to, the Jewish scriptures and the Jewish way of life, and to the monotheism that Judaism represents, one God to be worshipped rather than a whole pantheon of Roman gods. And so Cornelius is among those significant number of people who have kind of attached themselves to Judaism, are practicing Jewish ways, but are not considered part of the fold, are not considered real Jews. And so they're referred to as God-fearers or devout men, but they're still outside the pretty firm boundaries of the Jewish faith. What's, I think another thing that we could say is, in that capacity, as somebody who is practicing some important tenets of the Jewish faith, Cornelius almost certainly knew about the hope of a Messiah, because that was such an important part of Judaism. But what he doesn't know is, he doesn't know who the Messiah is, right? Or that the Messiah has come. And that is the critical revelation that Cornelius still needs to hear about and believe in, put his faith in, is that this Jewish Messiah who has been promised has in fact already come, and is Jesus. And it is Peter, the apostle, who now can share that with him.
It also says that all his household feared God. It wasn't just him. In verse 2, it says all his household also.
That's good. I'm glad you picked up on that. That's significant too, right? It shows that he was such a firm believer in these things that he taught it to presumably to his children, and encouraged his servants, if he had servants, to practice that, his spouse. So this was something that he and his household did together. Yeah. Speaks to the strength of his convictions, I think. Any other insights or questions about these first 8 verses before we move on? Okay, so Cornelius is visited by an angel.
How do you see an angel?
How do you see an angel? When an angel makes themselves visible, you see them.
There you go.
When an
Okay.
angel chooses to be invisible, you do not see them. Yeah. So angels are different from human beings in that angels are spirit beings, right? They were not created with bodies, and yet they often appear in bodily form and in human form. But they are free as spirit beings made by God to take on different forms or no visible form at all. Yeah. What differentiates them from humans? I mean, one of the many things that differentiates angels from humans. No. All right. Well, let's read. Okay, so Cornelius is visited by an angel telling him to invite Peter to come to him from Joppa. And now we're going to get on the other end of the equation. We're going to see how God simultaneously visits Peter and prompts him to do, right? It's like we see God's hand maneuvering in all of these things. Unbeknownst to either man, God is involved in both of their lives, preparing to bring them together. It's really cool to see that. So let's read verses 9 through 16.
The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a green sheet or a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven.
Now, at first, it may not seem exactly clear what that vision has to do with Cornelius, but it's all leading there. It's leading Peter in a certain direction. So as Cornelius was visited by a vision of an angel, so Peter also has his own vision. Interesting, both men have their visions at praying hours. So Peter, went up on the housetop about the 6th hour or noon to pray. Cornelius, we're told, was constantly in prayer, and it was about the 9th hour, the 3 o'clock hour, which was an appointed time of prayer for Jews and Jewish proselytes. So he would have been praying too. So that's an interesting thing to note, is that both men were in prayer when they received their visions. What was Peter's vision? How would you summarize it? Kind of
Eat something you're not supposed to.
Yeah. So he sees the vision he sees is something. I like how the Greek word for something is just that. It's like a thing, right? It's like there's no word for what he saw, but Luke says it was something like a sheet, whatever that, something flat, I guess, but something bearing a whole menagerie of animals, presumably animals of many kinds, but among them were unclean animals. So I don't want to presume that we all know what unclean animals are. Can somebody give a stab at sort of describing why would Peter refuse to eat certain animals?
It's something about the hoof. I don't remember what it is, but it's something about the hoof things, so many parts. I don't know. I don't remember.
So when it came to, so all of this comes out of the Old Testament dietary laws that God gave to his people, Israel, in the Old Testament. And you can go back and you can read about these in Leviticus 11, for instance. They're actually found outside of Leviticus as well. You can find them in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and probably other places too. But what you're referring to, Margaret, that's right. When it came to 4-legged animals that provide meat, think, cows, horses, pigs, chickens, or no, not chickens, because those are birds. But when it came to those sort of 4-legged mammals, the rule was it had to have a split hoof and it had to chew its cud. If it didn't meet those 2 criteria, it was not to be consumed as food. Also, according to Leviticus 11, if it was a fish, if it was any kind of seafood, it had to have scales and fins. So this would make things like, lobster and clams and oysters, oysters. This would have made those kinds of food, because they don't have scales and fins, those would have been unclean sea life and not to be eaten by the Jewish people. And then when it came to birds, there's sort of an interesting list of birds that are forbidden to eat, and some of them are predatory birds like eagles and falcons and hawks of different kinds, and then others are scavenging birds like vultures, were not to be eaten. Other birds could be eaten, but very specific rules about animals that could and could not be eaten if you were a Jew. So why does Peter refuse to eat? Because he considers him a good Jew and considers himself a good, Orthodox Jew, and would not dare consume a food that his whole life, I mean, you think about that, his whole life, he has been told, don't ever eat that, right? There's a real taboo on these foods. They're considered, you shouldn't be around them. And yet, what does God say? Well, it doesn't say it's God. What does it say? It says the voice came to him. There came a voice. And that's intriguing to think, was, whose voice was it? Was it the voice of an angel? Was it the voice of the Heavenly Father? Was it the voice of Jesus? Was it a voice that Peter would have recognized very, very well? We're not told. But the voice says, what God has made clean, do not call common. Common being a synonym for unclean.
Now, in my Bible, the what God has cleansed, you must not call common, is in red, and that my Bible, it means Jesus talking.
Right. Yep, that would have been putting that print in red would mean that the translators of that Bible believe that it was Jesus himself who spoke, just as we know Jesus spoke to Saul on the road to Damascus, right? Yeah, certainly a strong possibility that was Jesus himself giving this command to Peter. Kind of another interesting detail of this is how many times does Peter refuse? How many times did this go on? It doesn't just happen once. Verse 16. Verse 16, it says it happened 3 times. 3 times he's commanded to kill and eat, and 3 times he says, I will not do it. That to me is interesting because it echoes the 3 times that Jesus denied Jesus. It also echoes the time after the resurrection when Jesus says, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Right? So everything with Peter seems to happen in 3s. Maybe that's an indication that he needs repetition. I don't know, but so what do we make of this? This is quite, on one hand you say that's quite a radical change for poor Peter, right? That's a lot for him to process. If you've been told your whole life that something is wrong, and now to be for even a voice from heaven, but to say, no, this is clean and this is okay. And in fact, to make that clear, I am commanding you to kill and eat. Remember, Peter was very hungry. So, he had an incentive to eat something, but he does not want to eat the foods that are represented on this sheet.
But doesn't it, I think Peter won here because the thing was taken back up. He didn't kill and eat.
He won. Okay. Peter won. Well, yeah. That's an interesting point, Norm. I hadn't thought about that. It never says that Peter. This is a vision, right? So were the animals ever really there, or was this just a vision of animals? That's interesting. Interesting to think about. But at any rate, as what's the word? As confounding, as surprising as this was for Peter, evidenced by his protests, protesting, he's so repulsed by the idea that he even protests against a heavenly voice. But in fact, this is not the first time that the concept of all foods being clean has come up in the Gospels. You may remember Jesus talked about this and taught on this subject in the Gospels, and we can see one example of this. The clearest example of this is in the Gospel of Mark. If you just want to turn to Mark chapter 7. Mark 7:14 through 19. We get some really important words of Jesus himself on the matter of foods and cleanliness. Mark 7:14 through 19, if somebody could read that.
Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. Are you so dull? He asked. Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? If it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach and then out of his body. In this saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. You want to finish? And when he went on?
But no, I guess for our purposes, that was good. But you see it stated so clearly, right? By Mark, the evangelist, saying, by this, Jesus declared all foods clean. So it's clear to us, New Testament readers of the Bible, it was obviously not clear to Peter, and probably not to any of the disciples. It was going to be a long time before they grasped that. I point that out because we want to remember that these apostles, these were men, they were mortals just like us. And you hear something once, that doesn't mean you learned it. You have to hear it. Sometimes you have to hear something or see something over and over again before it sinks in. So even though Jesus taught on this all the way back in Mark 7, it still seems to catch Peter by surprise. Here in Acts chapter 10, he's still living by the strict dietary laws of the Jewish people. So if you ever feel like you're dull of mind and have trouble grasping spiritual truths or the teachings of Jesus, just remember that, Peter was the same way. And it takes time, and it takes Peter going through all these different experiences to learn and maybe to relearn some of these important truths that Jesus was teaching. Does anybody want to give a stab? I mean, I think all of this, the whole dietary laws thing, and the very strict rules on what a faithful Jewish person could and could not eat. Now remember, those were not made up by men. Those were handed down from God through Moses, the Levitical laws. And that really raises the question, in my mind, I think, why did God make those laws in the first place if he was just going to overturn them with the coming of Christ? Have you ever wondered that?
Well, doesn't it go with so many things like the sacrifices and all the things that Christ changed? I mean, that's what he was all about. He turned everything upside down.
He did.
In a good way.
Yeah. But I guess, yes, absolutely, Amy. We see that in so many ways, Jesus seems to overturn or reverse Old Testament laws. But at the same time, we don't want to fall into the trap of saying that the Old Testament was wrong and Jesus and the New Testament are right. So somehow we have to make sense of why those dietary laws were given in the first place, right? God was, yeah, go ahead.
To set them apart.
Very good. I think that's a great way to say it. That the reason Israel was given these dietary restrictions all the way back in Leviticus was because God was teaching them what it means to be set apart and what it means to be holy to the Lord, which means not like the rest of the world. Distinct. And you start, right? God starts teaching his people that the way you start with a child. You can't teach a child in very sort of abstract ways. You have to teach a child in very concrete ways that they can see and feel and experience and touch. So my thinking on this is that the dietary laws, in themselves, the foods were never sinful. The point of God declaring them off limits was a very tangible, they're going to experience this every day, right? The foods that you eat or don't eat are things that you're going to contend with that every day. You're going to be faced with, and if any of you have ever been on a diet and had select foods that you could not eat, you know what that's like. It's like every day you have to avoid those foods. I mean, if you're serious about it. And, there are certain establishments you probably can't go to because they serve all the things that you can't eat. So just think about what a powerful teaching tool that would be for this fledgling nation, right? That's barely a nation, that's just been called out of slavery, and how God needs them to understand that they are wholly set apart in every way from the rest of the world. And so he tells them there are certain ways you can and cannot dress. There are certain haircuts you can and cannot wear. There are certain foods you can and cannot eat. It's a very regulated, and in some ways, yes, very restrictive way of life, but it's not without its purpose. The purpose is to begin to shape, and here's the thing, is begin to shape the character and the self-understanding of the Israelites, that they are a set-apart people. And I've never served in the military, but it'd be interesting to hear somebody who has. Does any of this sound familiar, right? That when you enter into the military, my understanding is you go into a very highly regulated and restrictive environment. And it's not arbitrary. It's meant to reshape you into developing a new self-understanding, that you're part of a group set apart.
Civilians are a different world.
Yeah. Civilians are a different world. Yeah, right. Yeah. So as odd as these, it's easy for us to kind of chuckle at the fact that, well, Jewish people, to this day, Orthodox Jewish people don't eat don't eat pork, or, they can't eat this, or they can't eat that, or they're not allowed to do this or that. It's easy to kind of laugh at that as New Testament Christians who've never been under that system, but understand that at the time it was instituted, for that period of time, the Old Testament era that God had instituted those laws, they did have a purpose, and God did expect his people to follow those laws, right? The punishments for disobeying those laws or disregarding them were quite severe. So they did serve a purpose. That having been said, they served their purpose for that time, and then that purpose was fulfilled, and so the restrictions were lifted. I want us to think about those dietary laws that were in effect up until the coming of Christ as very healthy boundaries placed around the people of God. Boundaries of, food, clothing, and even nationality, right? There were boundaries, Old Testament boundaries, around who could be considered part of the nation of Israel. And it's not like in the New Testament era, boundaries don't matter. It's not like there are no such things as boundaries anymore. But in the New Testament era with Christ, the boundaries are no longer physical. They're no longer about food and clothing and nationality. Now, the only boundaries that exist around the church that are defining of the church are things like faith in Jesus Christ and true repentance and a public confession of the faith, right? These become the demarcating lines, but anybody can be a part of that. You don't have to be born and raised in the Jewish in the Jewish ethnicity in order to be a part of that. Anybody can come to believe in Christ and repent of their sins and belong as full citizens of the kingdom of God. That's the shift. It's a
And that
shift.
must have been extreme importance to Luke. Luke, who was not from the Jewish tradition, wanting to figure out, make sure that he has the right to be one with them and unified with them. That would have been very important for Luke, and why he spent so much time on it in Acts.
That's a good point, Roger. Luke himself was a Gentile, and there's some theorizing that maybe even Luke was one of these God-fearing devout Gentiles who went through that process of being first looked at as sort of a hanger-on and an outsider to the Jewish faith, to then understanding himself and sharing with us the good news that no, even he, a God-fearing Gentile, belongs within the fold, right? Is a full-fledged citizen of the kingdom. So this is all leading to a greater point. Peter getting this vision about foods being declared clean, but we know that in just a very short verses, we're going to be brought to a greater truth, which is that people are made clean by God, regardless of their being Romans or their being soldiers, right? That Cornelius can be seen as clean in the eyes of God, and therefore someone with whom Peter can spend time and go to his house and eat with him. So it's a movement from the lesser to the greater. The lesser but very important truth that all foods are clean, to the greater and more important truth that there are no boundaries around the gospel as far as who can be a part of God's kingdom. There is no ethnic group, there is no cultural limitations that should bound our sharing of the gospel. So I'll just ask maybe an obvious question, but just dwelling for one more minute on this idea of clean and unclean food. Should Christians have rules about food today?
Take care of our bodies.
Okay. We should eat food that takes care of our bodies, that is good for our bodies. Yeah.
Well, gluttony.
Okay, right. So we're free to eat any kind of food, but we're not free. Christ did not set us free to eat any amount of food that our sinful flesh might want. Yeah, right. Good. The sin of gluttony forbids us to overindulge. Yeah. But as far as particular foods, right? Christians should not be in the business of declaring particular foods to be off limits to Christians as a whole, because God has spoken clearly on this, that all foods are clean and permissible. Now, I want to, I was thinking about this just in the context of the day in which we are living, the age in which we are living, in which there are so many strong opinions about food and nutrition and diet. And while I certainly don't want to discount any of that, I think as Christians, we always need to be cognizant that God has made this declaration that that there are no foods that are inherently wrong or sinful to consume. Certainly, we need to be good stewards. We need to be wise in that area. but we don't want to fall into the trap of legalism. And legalism is creating laws, the desire to create laws where God has not made laws, and to create restrictions where God has not set restrictions. What's interesting is that we're studying this tonight, and on Sunday, this coming Sunday, the epistle is Romans 14. Would you mind just turning to Romans 14 with me? I found this very serendipitous that this reading was coming up because it directly addresses this. Romans 14, verses 1 through 6. If somebody, I think this is just a really clear and beautiful passage about Christian freedom, where Paul writes about some issues that were still going on in the early church and gives some really helpful Christian guidance on this. So if somebody would read Romans 14, 1 to 6.
Welcome the person who is weak in faith, but do not argue with him about his personal opinions. One person's faith allows him to eat anything, but the person who is weak in the faith eats only vegetables. The person who will eat anything is not to despise the one who doesn't, while the one who eats only vegetables is not to pass judgment on the one who will eat anything, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of anybody else? It is his own master who will decide whether he succeeds or fails, and he will succeed because the Lord is able to make him succeed.
Couple more verses.
Pardon?
Well, a couple more verses, if you would. Could you read 5 and 6 as well?
Oh, sure. One person thinks that a certain day is more important than other days, while someone else thinks that all days are the same. Each one should firmly make up his own mind. Whoever thinks highly of a certain day does so in honor of the Lord. Whoever will eat anything does so in honor of the Lord, because he gives thanks to God for the food. Whoever refuses to eat certain things does so in honor of the Lord, and he gives thanks to God.
Yeah. So, I mean, isn't that just so helpful? It's just such good, helpful advice from Paul. Is he says there's a general principle here, and it's not, do you eat this certain food or do you abstain from that food? The principle is, where we have broad Christian freedom to practice our faith, do it in a way that shows honor to the Lord, whichever one you do, right? That's the principle. If you abstain to the Lord. If you eat a food, eat it with the Lord in mind, right? And so it's just like Jesus was saying, it's more about the attitude of your heart and your mind than what it is that you're putting in your stomach. If we just bring an attitude to everything we do of, I do this with gratitude to the Lord who gave me this, then we're honoring God. And we shouldn't be, as Christians, looking around for, well, you're not doing it the way I'm doing it, or you're not following, what I think is right. It's like, let's let that freedom be what it is and let people follow their own conscience. I think about this in terms of fasting, fasting is a fine practice. Many Christians fast during the Lenten season or outside the Lenten season. And that's a practice that can be commended as very biblical. And at the same time, we don't want to turn fasting into a law, right? Where we bind people's consciences and say, you have to fast. And well, I'm fasting, but you're not fasting, so you're not as good of a Christian as I am. That's just one example of where I think that kind of judgmental attitude can really do a disservice to the body of Christ. Any other thoughts on that particular topic of foods and judgment?
Just a
question. I've sort of been racking my brain to think if there are any common denominations that do have any prohibitions like that. You know, I know alcohol for some and things like that.
Yeah,
Are there others you know of?
I think of Seventh-day Adventists. They
Mm.
follow Seventh-day Adventists. Well, first of all, they insist that worship must be on Saturday, the seventh day, the Sabbath. And so they don't believe Christians should be free to worship any day of the week, but it needs to be Saturday. And they also, I remember talking to a Seventh-day Adventist that, at least the one I talked to, said they follow the Old Testament dietary laws. Now, I kind of find it hard to believe they follow all of the Old Testament dietary laws, because if you really follow it to a T, it becomes quite restrictive. But he said he didn't eat pork as a Seventh-day Adventist. So outside of that, my experience, I don't usually run into this. I more think of it in terms of individuals who hold to kind of peculiar ideas about you shouldn't eat that, right?
Sure.
Almost making people feel like they're sinning by eating a certain food. And I just think as Christians, we need to be really careful about the way we talk about that. We can have our opinions about something not being good for you or more or less nutritious. And certainly we shouldn't encourage a free-for-all of gluttony, but we should be careful not to put down other people for choosing to eat foods that God has declared clean. Yeah.
Do Catholics still have restrictions on Friday?
They do. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. No meat Fridays. Yeah. And I don't know, I won't speak for the Catholic Church. I'm not a Catholic or a former Catholic, so I don't know if that gets presented as you are sinning if you eat meat on Friday, or how that gets, how that gets taught or presented. So I don't know, but that is a kind of seasonal restriction that they have.
Orthodox Christians like Russian Orthodox or so during Lent won't eat meat a certain number of hours before they have communion.
Okay. Sure.
Michelle, what else do you remember?
I don't know, with Catholics on no meat Fridays, I don't know of any of them. I don't know any Catholic that follows that in this time, except perhaps for Good Friday.
There's a fair number, and a lot of them's old school. But yeah, a fair number still do the no meat Friday.
Yeah.
And also what was said about eating an hour before that is still held. How many personally practice it, I can't vouch for, but
Hey, Bob, it must be those Pennsylvania Catholics.
absolutely. Yeah, they carry the day.
Yeah. And see, I think if we can talk about the different denominations and the things that they do without, while refraining from judgment, like I think that's a fine practice, right? Of fasting before you come to the Lord's Supper. I think that's a fine practice. Luther talks about that in the Small Catechism. I would not require it of every church member. I wouldn't impose it as a law, but it's just interesting to hear the different devotional practices that people have. And, if we can just be sort of curious about it and gracious about it and say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me why you do that. And how do you find that helpful? And, and if I decide that I want to take up that practice for my own spiritual benefit as a way to honor the Lord, I might do that.
Just even for our own selves on Sunday, depending on how long your sermons are, we might go an hour before we get to do the sacrament.
It's true. This is true. By no choice of your own, you may be fasting, right? Yeah. So it's an interesting topic. I mean, you know as well as I, we live in a culture that in some way idolizes food, stigmatizes food. I mean, just look at the number of TV shows about food and food preparation. So we're a culture in some ways obsessed with food, even as we're also obsessed with abstaining from food. And making laws about it and subjecting ourselves to all sorts of restrictions. what I love about this reading tonight is it reminds us that from God's point of view, we get so caught up in the foods themselves. We need to elevate our thinking and see things the way God sees them, which is there's a much more important thing to focus on, which is, are we doing these things, whatever we're doing, are we doing them to the Lord? It's the mindset, it's the heart, right? Because Jesus says that it's what comes out of the heart, not the stomach, that shows a person's spiritual health. And
I guess my perspective is that with all of these shows that you were just talking about that say this is the way we should eat, you should avoid dairy, you can't because you're lactose. I don't think that those are generated by any spirituality. I think it's strictly physical.
No. Yeah, no, I would agree with you. Spirituality is not brought up explicitly. What I think can sometimes happen, and again, I'm not picking on any one show. I love cooking shows. I think they're fun. But sometimes when people don't have a spiritual life and don't have, when they're not following God's word, things like food or clothing can become sort of a default spirituality for them, where they pour all of their efforts into those realms of living, into the way they appear, into the way they clothe themselves, into the foods they eat or abstain from. That sort of becomes its own kind of
idol.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm talking about, right? Where it's all they think about. And again, I'm not talking about dietary things where people have food allergies or medical issues. I'm just talking about people who a culture that really just almost obsesses over the outward, right? Outward appearances, outward practices, but has no sense of the deeper spiritual state of a man, of a woman. Right?
John, I'm thinking of the Amish and their clothing. Not so much dietary, but clothing. Oh my.
Yeah, certain Amish, right, are very restrictive on the types of clothing they will wear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I hope this kind of spurred thinking. It wasn't too kind of niche or off the wall, but to me, I found it very sort of fascinating to think about why the dietary laws existed in the first place, the significance of God overturning them, and the time it took for men like Peter, who, take their faith very seriously, the time it took to finally become convinced, for sort of that light bulb to slowly come on to say, God is doing a new thing, right? God is calling for holiness of another kind, of another level, beyond just I watch what I eat and I watch who I hang out with, right? I watch who I'll sit down at table with. It's something much deeper and more Christ focused and more gospel centric than that.
Another thing might be he wanted the nation was small when it was first started with Abraham.
Yeah.
Some of the dietary laws would keep the people healthier, like I've heard about shrimp and lobster, that he wanted the nation to grow, and that's why they also had to stay away from other nations so that they wouldn't get absorbed into the surrounding nations. So
yes.
Maybe it was enough time, the nation was large enough that he didn't need the laws anymore.
Yeah. No, that's a good point too. You can see several different possible rationales, right? Some of the hygiene laws of the Levitical code were like, yeah, that's just good practice, right? To stay healthy and clean. And some of those animals, you might say, well, they're just not they could get you sick if you're not careful in how you prepare them or something like that. So I think, yeah, physical health was important to the Lord and to his people. So in that regard, they could have served a useful purpose too. All right, well, I see it's 8:30, so I'm gonna wrap this up for us tonight. But so again, we're moving from the lesser to the greater. Tonight we talked about unclean foods. Next week we'll talk about who does God consider an unclean person, and what does it mean to be a clean person in the eyes of God, and how God's going to bring Peter and Cornelius together in the same room, and it's going to lead to another great Pentecost-like outpouring of the Spirit and a new revelation, not just for Cornelius, but for Peter as well, and for the whole church. Thank you, everybody. Let's go ahead.